5 friends, Mark, Jesse, Amber, Natalie, and Ethan, stood at the edge of the dense forest, backpacks slung over their shoulders. This camping trip had been Mark's idea, a chance for all of them to escape their daily grind and reconnect. They'd been inseparable since high school, but as the years passed, work and life had pushed them apart. Mark insisted a weekend in the woods would reignite the old bond. The air was cool, with the scent of pine and damp earth hanging heavy around them. The deeper they walked into the forest, the thicker the trees became, their towering forms blocking out most of the sunlight. Amber, always the most cautious, couldn't shake a nagging feeling. She slowed her pace, glancing behind her at the narrow dirt path winding out of view. "This place is a little too remote," she said, her voice tinged with unease. "That's the whole point," Mark replied, grinning over his shoulder. "We're here to disconnect. No phones, no stress. Just us and nature." Amber forced a smile, but her stomach churned with dread. She glanced at Jesse, her boyfriend, who was lagging behind, clearly distracted by something. He had been distant lately, more withdrawn, but she hadn't pressed him. This trip was supposed to help clear the air between them, too. She had hoped for peace, but something about the isolation already weighed on her, tightening like a noose. By the time they reached the campsite, the sun had started to dip, casting long shadows that stretched through the forest like fingers grasping for the ground. They pitched their tents in a small clearing, the fire crackling at the center. The mood lightened as the group laughed and shared stories, their nervous energy fading into the background as night settled around them. But as the darkness deepened, the forest began to shift. The first sign that something was wrong came just after midnight. Ethan was the first to hear it. The rustling of leaves that didn't match the wind, the snapping of twigs, too deliberate to be random. "Did you hear that?" he asked, sitting up straight, his eyes scanning the tree line. Jesse waved him off. "Relax, it's just animals. We're in the middle of the woods. What did you expect?" Ethan nodded, but his heart was still pounding. He tried to shake off the unease, leaning back and staring into the fire, but something in the shadows seemed to move, lurking just beyond the light. As the group continued talking, Amber couldn't help but notice Jesse seemed more on edge than anyone else. His laughter was forced, his eyes darting toward the darkness every few minutes. It wasn't like him. He had always been the calm one, the rational one, but now, something about him seemed off. Later, when they crawled into their sleeping bags, Amber felt the tension settle in her bones. She could hear Jesse slow, even breathing next to her, but it didn't calm her. Sleep was elusive, her mind racing with thoughts of the strange noises in the forest and Jesse's growing unease. By morning, the mood had shifted. Natalie was the first to say it. "I had the worst dream last night." She rubbed her temples, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. It felt so real. I was lost in the woods, and I could hear someone calling my name, but when I turned around, no one was there. Amber shuddered. "I had a weird dream too. I kept hearing footsteps outside the tent, like someone was walking around us." The others exchanged nervous glances, but Jesse remained silent, staring into the fire with a dark look in his eyes. When Amber touched his arm, he flinched, pulling away without a word. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. Jesse didn't answer. He just stood and walked away from the camp, disappearing into the trees. Amber's stomach twisted. She turned to the others. "What's going on with him?" Mark shrugged, but his face was pale. "Maybe he's just not used to the woods. Give him some space." But Amber wasn't convinced. She followed Jesse, weaving through the trees until she found him by a stream, crouched low, his hands submerged in the icy water. His expression was blank, his eyes fixed on the rippling current as if he was in a trance. "Jesse?" she called softly, stepping closer. He didn't move. A chill ran down her spine, and when she reached out to touch his shoulder, his head snapped toward her, his eyes wide and wild. "I can hear it," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Something's out there, watching us." By the time they returned to camp, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Mark and Ethan were arguing over the firewood, their voices sharp and angry, while Natalie sat on a log, her face buried in her hands, mumbling to herself. Amber's skin prickled with fear. Something was wrong. Something deeper than just Jesse's odd behavior. The second night was worse. The air was thick with tension, every little sound magnified by their frayed nerves. When the fire died down, none of them slept. At some point, Ethan swore he saw shadows moving between the trees, creeping closer to the campsite, but every time he pointed it out, nothing was there. The group began turning on each other, accusing one another of playing tricks, of not taking the trip seriously. But the look in Jesse's eyes, the sheer terror that had taken root there, told Amber this wasn't just some prank. And then the whispers started. Soft, barely audible at first, but unmistakable. A voice calling from the woods, echoing in their ears, though none of them could quite make out the words. Jesse's paranoia reached a breaking point. He claimed the voice was calling to him, urging him to do something, to end it all. "Do you hear it?" Jesse hissed to Amber, grabbing her arm with a vice-like grip. "It's telling me. They're not real. They're not who they say they are." Amber recoiled, fear swelling in her chest. "Jesse, you're scaring me." "They've been lying to us this whole time," Jesse muttered, pacing back and forth. "They don't care about us." This whole trip was a setup. Amber shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Jesse, stop. You're not making any sense." But Jesse wouldn't stop. He wouldn't calm down. And by the third night, the group had completely unraveled. Natalie wouldn't speak, her eyes wide and hollow as she stared into the dark. Mark and Ethan were barely speaking to each other, their words sharp and cold. The once strong bond of friendship had disintegrated into suspicion and fear. And then, everything broke. In the dead of night, while the others slept, Jesse acted. Amber woke to the sound of screaming Mark's voice, panicked and pained. She scrambled out of the tent, her heart racing, only to find Jesse standing over Mark, his hands slick with blood, holding a jagged rock. "They were going to leave us here," Jesse whispered, his face twisted with madness. "They wanted us to die." Amber screamed, backing away, her mind spinning with horror. Ethan rushed to Mark's side, but it was too late. Mark's eyes were wide, unblinking, his body limp. Jesse turned to Amber, his expression softening for a brief moment. "It's just us now. You and me, Amber. We're the only ones who matter." Jesse turned to Amber, his expression softening for a brief moment. "It's just us now. You and me, Amber. We're the only ones who matter." "Jesse, please," she begged, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." But Jesse's smile widened. "It's too late. I already have." As Amber turned and ran, her heart hammering in her chest, she knew she would never escape. Not the forest, not the memories, and certainly not Jesse. He had ruined them all physically, mentally, and emotionally. And as she disappeared into the dark woods, Jesse's laughter followed her, echoing through the trees. Zoe was running. No, sprinting. Branches lashed at her face, slicing her skin, but she barely felt it. All that mattered was getting away. Her lungs felt like they were on fire. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might explode. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't stop. Something huge was behind her. She didn't know what it was. Didn't want to know. It was fast. Too fast. She'd caught glimpses of it through the trees. Shadows. Dark. Big. Definitely not human. Her mind couldn't wrap around it, but her body, it knew. Every instinct screamed run, so she kept running. Her thoughts were a mess. Flashes of things she didn't want to think about. Anna. Anna had fallen. She remembered that part. The scream. The way it had sliced through the night, freezing Zoe's blood in her veins. But she hadn't been able to stop. She couldn't. Not with that thing so close. And now Anna was gone. Gone. The ground started to get rockier. Big chunks of earth and stone jutting out like the forest itself was trying to trip her up. She stumbled, almost face-planting into the dirt, but she caught herself at the last second. Her ankle throbbed, twisted from the awkward step, but that didn't matter right now. She couldn't let herself fall. Not like Anna. Behind her, she heard it. A deep, low growl. It didn't sound right, like it came from somewhere darker, somewhere that shouldn't exist. And it was getting closer. Suddenly, a voice cut through the trees. Lucas's voice. Zoe whipped her head around and saw him. His face was pale, eyes wide and wild with fear, but he was alive. Bloody and battered, but alive. "Zoe!" he screamed, limping toward her like he could barely keep himself upright. Hope flared in her chest. "Lucas!" she shouted back, her voice cracking. She was about to run toward him when it happened, so fast she almost didn't register it. 1 second, Lucas was there, running, and the next, a huge shape, something dark and twisted, lunged out of the trees and yanked him back. It dragged him into the shadows and then nothing. Gone, just like that. She wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Her legs felt weak, like they were going to give out. Her whole body was shaking so violently she thought she might collapse right there. Lucas was gone. Anna was gone. They were all... No, she couldn't think like that. Not yet. Not yet. She stumbled forward, half limping, half running, her mind spinning out of control. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't even know if they were from pain, fear, or grief anymore. Probably all three. She could barely think straight. It felt like the woods were closing in on her, like they were alive, like they were trying to keep her trapped here with that thing. And God, what was that thing? It wasn't an animal, at least not one she'd ever seen, and it sure as hell wasn't human. It was something else, something worse. She had to keep moving. She had to, even though her body was screaming at her to stop, to collapse, to give in. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She limped through the trees, each step agony, her ankle throbbing harder with every second. Her breaths were ragged, coming in sharp gasps, and her chest felt tight, like she couldn't get enough air. But the fear kept her going. The fear of whatever was out there, lurking just behind her, waiting. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same. There was no way out, no sign of any road or anything. Just trees, darkness, and that whisper. Yeah, there was whispering now. At first, Zoe thought she was imagining it, her own brain betraying her. But no, it was real. Soft, faint, but definitely there. She couldn't make out what it was saying. It didn't even sound like words, just sounds. A low, raspy murmur that made her skin crawl, coming from everywhere, surrounding her. Her head snapped to the left. She saw something tall and dark moving through the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. She stumbled backward, her breathing picking up, and she almost fell. But then she heard it again. The whispering, louder this time, more insistent, like it was calling her. No, mocking her, telling her to keep running, telling her she couldn't escape, telling her she was already theirs. Her heart raced faster. She tried to keep moving, but her body wasn't cooperating. Her ankle hurt so much now that it felt like it was on fire. That's when she saw it. A figure, standing in the clearing ahead. Tall, lanky, shadowy, staring right at her. Zoe's entire body froze. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was. The figure didn't move, just stood there, waiting, watching. Its eyes, God, those eyes burned with a cold, eerie glow. Her stomach dropped. She wanted to turn and run, but she couldn't. She couldn't move. Then it started walking toward her, slow, deliberate steps, and behind it, more figures emerged from the woods. Tall, twisted shapes, all of them with that same awful glow in their eyes closing in on her. She was trapped. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. Zoe opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers surrounded her, louder now, ringing in her ears like they were laughing at her, telling her she was done. Her body shook with terror, her legs buckling beneath her. She had been running this whole time, running like it mattered, like there was some way out. But now she saw it for what it was, a game. They'd been toying with her, hurting her. There was no escape. There never had been. And as the figures drew closer, the whispers turned into a chorus of eerie, low voices that echoed through the clearing. Run, keep running. But Zoe didn't have any fight left, and they knew it.